Hello Daily Drafters and welcome to the March of the Machine Limited Archetype Guide here on the Daily Draft channel. This video will cover all of the limited archetypes, key cards, synergies, and more so that you can effectively prepare for your first draft of the new set when it releases on MTG Arena on Tuesday, April the 18th. We're going to learn how to battle our way to victory with some extra backup, so let's dive in. Before we hop into the content for this video, I'd appreciate it if you would consider subscribing to the channel if you aren't already. These set reviews take a lot of time and have to be done on a very strict schedule, and I'm doing everything I can to get them to you when I know you need them. Remember, YouTube doesn't allow any content creators to make a single penny off of their YouTube content unless they have a minimum of 1,000 subscribers, and as of the recording of this video, we are rapidly approaching that number. So if you think I deserve to be rewarded for the content that I make, a subscription is all that's needed to help the channel head in the right direction. It's absolutely free for you, so there's really no reason not to. Before we look at our first archetype for this video, let's go over the new and returning mechanics for this set so we have an idea what we are dealing with. And we're going to dive in head first with what is likely the most complicated but also interesting new mechanic, which is battles. Battles are a new permanent type, and also interestingly, it's the first new permanent type since Planeswalker, and they actually function relatively similarly to Planeswalkers. When you cast a battle, it enters the battlefield under your control, but is defended by your opponent. From this point on, go ahead and think of this battle as a Planeswalker that your opponent controls, but that doesn't provide any value for them. You can choose to attack that battle, you can damage that battle, and your opponent can defend the battle by assigning their creatures as blockers to your attackers. The number in the bottom right-hand corner of the battle indicates the number of defense counters that it will enter the battlefield with, similarly to Planeswalker's loyalty counters. When this battle enters the battlefield, it will function as a normal permanent with enter the battlefield abilities or otherwise that exist on the front of the card. When you are able to successfully remove the final defense counter from the battle, likely through attacking it with your creatures, you then exile the battle and cast the backside of the card without paying its mana cost. Note that if this battle is destroyed or leaves the battlefield in any way other than because its last defense counter was removed, you will not get to cast the backside. There will be 36 different battles in this set, including one battle in every draft pack. So let's take a look at Invasion of Ravnica, which is 5 generic mana for a battle that enters with 4 defense counters, and when it enters, you get to exile a permanent that isn't exactly 2 colors. If at any point you are able to remove its defense counters, you then get to cast Guild-Pact Paragon, which is a 5/5 artifact creature that does some sweet things when you cast 2 colored cards. Whew, that's about it for battles today. Hopefully you understand. The next mechanic that we'll take a look at is Backup. Backup is a new ability word that triggers when a creature with backup enters the battlefield. When it enters, you will target any creature on the battlefield to put a number of +1/+1 counters onto it, equal to the backup amount listed on the card. This creature could be the creature with backup, or it could be any other creature on the battlefield. If you choose a different creature, that creature will receive its +1/+1 counters, and it will receive all abilities of the backup creature that are listed underneath the backup line of text until end of turn. In the case of Boonbringer Valkyrie here, you can cast your 5 mana 4/4 flying first strike lifelinking creature, and when it enters the battlefield, you can put a +1/+1 counter on any creature you control, including the Valkyrie. If you chose the Valkyrie, you would have a 5/5 with flying, first strike, and lifelink. If you decided to choose a different creature, for example, until end of turn, that creature would also gain flying, first strike, and lifelink. A couple of corner case scenarios involving backup that likely won't matter too much for us limited players, but I figured I'd mention nonetheless, include the fact that backup creature will only pass on abilities that are printed onto the card underneath the backup text to your other creature. If you are able to respond to your own backup trigger by giving that creature extra abilities with other cards or effects, those effects will not be passed on to your other creature. Also, if you choose your Valkyrie to get the +1/+1 counter, it will not gain extra instances of its abilities until end of turn. It will simply just get a +1/+1 counter. Our next mechanic is Incubate. Incubate is a new keyword action that creates an incubator token. These tokens are a new predefined type of token that can actually transform, an ability we have never seen before on another token in Magic. An Incubator token is just an artifact that has the ability to pay 2 generic mana to transform it to its backside, which is a 0/0 artifact creature. Incubate will always come with a number, and that number is the number of +1/+1 counters that you will put on your Incubate token when it enters the battlefield so that when it transforms, it has relevant power and toughness. In the case of Merciless Repurposing, this card gives you the ability to exile a creature for 6 mana and create an Incubator token with 3 +1/+1 counters on it. Then, at some point, you can pay 2 generic mana to transform that token to get yourself a 3/3 creature. Next up, we have another take on transforming double-faced cards, beginning with yet another Elesh Norn. Each of the 5 Praetors in this set, including Elesh Norn, have an activated ability which allows you to pay an amount of mana to transform them into a saga. When the saga enters the battlefield, it will progress through its story as it usually does, but after its 3rd chapter resolves, the saga will then transform back into the Praetor on the front side of the card. These are relatively straightforward, even if there are hundreds of words on these absolute bomb mythic rares for us limited players. Our last mechanic is a returning mechanic from recent Ravnica sets, and that is Convoke. Convoke allows you to tap an untapped creature you control to assist in paying the cost of a spell. For each creature you tap, you may reduce the cost of your spell by a color of mana associated with that creature's color. That means that if you tap a red creature to assist in convoking out a spell, you can have that mana be red when counting toward the casting cost of your Convoke spell. In the case of Stoke the Flames here, you can pay 2 and 2 red to have it deal 4 damage to any target, or you could tap anywhere between 1 and 4 creatures to assist in paying its cost. And yes, if one of those creatures happens to also be red, you can use that mana to pay for Stoke the Flames red pips in its casting cost. Another thing to note about this set is that we have another instance of a bonus sheet in March of the Machine draft packs, and this time that slot is called the Multiverse Legends slot. Any number of well-known and well-liked legendary creatures from MTG sets of the past can show up in this slot in draft packs. So yes, that means there will be cards in this set that can be drafted that are not technically in the set proper. We've seen this as recently as Phyrexia All Will Be One, when all 5 of the recent Praetors could be opened in draft packs. You'll see cards like Emry Lurker of the Loch, Thalia Guardian of Thraben, OG Elesh Norn, and yes, even the dashing monkey himself, Ragavan. These cards will not become standard legal, but rather they will simply remain legal in whatever formats they are currently legal in. The last thing I wanted to go over for you all is the collation of the draft packs on MTG Arena. This has been getting more and more confusing over the years, so hopefully I'm able to clear it up for you for this set right now. Every March of the Machine draft pack booster will contain the following: 1 basic land or dual land, and dual lands will show up in 50% of packs, 8 commons, 2 uncommons, 1 double-faced card of any rarity, 1 single-faced card of the uncommon, rare, or mythic rarity, 1 battle card of the uncommon, rare, or mythic rarity, and 1 Multiverse Legend of the uncommon, rare, or mythic rarity. Now, this may look like you can get up to 4 mythics in your pack, but the max is actually 2. Your Multiverse Legend has the ability to be a rare or mythic, and then any one of the battle, single-faced, or double-faced cards have the ability to be a rare or mythic, but not any more than one of those. I know it's confusing, but I think understanding what's in your draft pack will go a long way in being able to know what you might be able to see in your future packs. Alright, with that look at the mechanics out of the way, let's take a look at the first archetype for today's video. The first archetype we'll cover today is Red-White, which is a deck advertised as a classic aggro deck with a hint of backup thrown in for good measure. We seem to get Red-White aggro in just about every single format nowadays, so let's see if the addition of backup can make this deck any more or less consistent. We'll start each archetype by looking at their signpost uncommons, including their uncommon battle card. So let's begin with Mirror Shield Hoplite. This 2-mana 2/2 tells us exactly what it wants the rest of the deck to be doing, and that's triggering backup plenty of times, as this guy will double that ability. A nice bonus to have if you're able to amass a large amount of backup in your deck. Our uncommon battle for this color pair is Invasion of Kylem, which is a nice aggressive buff to your creatures when it enters the battlefield, and can eventually turn into a spell that creates 2 3/2s with upside, an obvious inclusion in aggressive decks like this one. Now, what good would an aggro deck be without good aggressive creatures? So, let's start by taking a look at some of the good creatures in these colors, including some with backup, starting with Fearless Scald, which is a double striker with 3 power. Trailblazing Historian can give 1 creature per turn haste. Redcap Heel Slasher is a first striker with backup. Zhalfirin Lancer is a 3-mana 3/3 that can get bigger if you happen to have other knights in your deck. Swordsworn Cavalier is a 3-mana 3/1 with upside if you're able to build around the knight sub-theme. Sigiled Sentinel is a 3-mana 2/2 with vigilance that also has backup. And Bola Slinger is a 2/2 with backup that can tap down your opponent's blockers whenever it attacks. With every aggro deck comes a few combat tricks to help enable attacks and push damage. So let's take a look at a few, starting with Angelic Intervention, which can protect your creatures and give them an extra counter. Coming in Hot can give your creature +1/+0, and First Strike, and Scry's 1 for just 1 mana. And Inspired Charge is back, which gives your entire team +2/+1 at instant speed. There are several rares and mythics you can keep an eye out for if you're looking to get into red-white, and a few of them include Rampaging Raptor, which is a 4-mana 4/4 with haste, and a whole lot of other text that's just all upside. The aforementioned Boonbringer Valkyrie is an enormous flying first-striking life-linking creature that can even give those abilities to something else for a turn because it also has backup. And Dusk Legion Duelist plays perfectly in this deck as a 2-mana 2/2 that would love to have other creatures with backup put their +1/+1 counters on him so he can draw you extra cards. Next up we have Blue-White, which is interestingly one of the only tribal decks in the format, and the tribe in question is Knights. Knights tend to be on the more aggressive side, so we'll see if this archetype ends up being true to form, beginning with our signpost uncommon of Marshal of Zhalfir. It's not too difficult to see what the Marshal wants us to be doing here, as he simply buffs all the rest of our knights. Easy enough. The uncommon battle for this color pair is Invasion of Xerax, which is essentially a 4-mana bounce spell, but can eventually turn into a potentially big flying creature based on the number of creatures that you control. We'll start by taking a look at several of the knights that this deck could run, beginning with Infected Defector, which dies into an Incubate token. Knight of the New Coalition is a card that comes with 2 knights for the price of 1. Kithkin Billy Rider is a knight with double strike. Norn's Inquisitor is another knight that comes with Incubate synergies. Tiller of Flesh is a knight that rewards you for targeting your own creatures. Preening Champion is a flying knight that comes with another body. Xerax Strobe Knight is another knight that can continually make more knights if you've cast enough spells. And Thunderhead Squadron is a flying knight that can be convoked out for cheaper. Let's move on to some of the common and uncommon payoffs for this deck, beginning with Swordsworn Cavalier, which can gain First Strike when a knight ETBs. Zhalfirin Lancer can get bigger as other knights enter. And Protocol Knight can give out stun counters if you control other knights. Now, there aren't actually a ton of rare and mythic payoffs for this deck, and the only one I could find that remotely relates to the knight theme would be Knight Errant of Eos, which allows you to get a little extra card draw attached to a knight body. There is also Order of the Mirror, which is a 2-drop knight that can eventually transform into a 3/3 with a little bit of attacking upside. Next up we have Red-Black, and we've got another classic with Red-Black Sacrifice. This seems to be Red-Black's favorite theme, and when it's powerful, it's usually one of the best decks in the format. So let's see if it can keep up in this set, beginning with Stormclaw Rager, which lets you pay 1 mana to sack another creature or artifact to get a counter on it and draw a card. Our uncommon battle for this deck is Invasion of Asgol, which is 2 mana to make your opponent sacrifice a creature and lose 1 life, which can eventually turn into a 2/1 with Menace that can get bigger if things make their way to the graveyard. We'll start by taking a look at the sacrifice outlets available to us in these colors, beginning with Completed Huntmaster, which can sack other creatures and artifacts to incubate 3. Dreg Recycler can drain your opponent when sacking things. Final Flourish is a removal spell with Kicker that allows you to basically kill anything. Aki's Scrap Chomper can turn unwanted lands and artifacts into cards in hand. And Furnace Rains isn't necessarily an outlet, but will be a very important card to this archetype to steal and sack your opponent's creatures. So what exactly should you be sacrificing in this deck? Well, how about creatures like Flitting Gorilla, which could give you a little bit of top deck manipulation should you need it, Ichor Drinker is a cheap creature that can get extra value out of your graveyard. Nezumi Informant has already made your opponent discard a card, so why not sacrifice it for more value? Scornblade Berserker is a cheap card that can sacrifice itself to replace itself. Furnace Gremlin can incubate when it dies. And Rouse Reinforcements can make 2 sacrificable bodies with just 1 card. So what are a couple of the payoffs at common and uncommon for doing all this sacrificing? Well, a lot of them were already tied to the sack outlets that we've already seen, but a couple of extras include Gift of Completion, which lets you surveil when Phyrexians die, and Ichor Shade can continually grow with more and more sacrificing. A couple of outstanding rares and mythics for this archetype include Ayara, Widow of the Realm, which is a free sack outlet itself that also pays you off, and can eventually turn into a creature that can return those sacrificed creatures back to the battlefield. And Bloated Processor is a free sack outlet you can do multiple times a turn with Phyrexians to grow it, and eventually have it die into a large Incubate token. Next up we have Red-Green, which is the deck that cares the most about battles. This will be a tough one to judge early on until we can figure out how good battles actually are, but let's start with our signpost uncommon, which is Rampaging Geoderm, which is a 4-mana 3/3 with haste that allows you to temporarily buff creatures whenever you attack at all, and if they're attacking a battle, then they get a counter instead. Our gold battle for the archetype is Invasion of Urgamon, which is 2 mana to get a treasure token, and Rummage that can eventually become a 3/4 trample that can turn a card in your hand into a land or another battle if needed. Let's start by taking a look at the cards in these colors that interact favorably with battles, beginning with Onaki Javelineer, which is a huge creature that can simply tap to deal 2 damage to a player or a battle. Thrashing Frontliner is a 2-mana 2/2 that can get temporarily bigger when it attacks a battle. War-Trained Slasher can double its power whenever it attacks a battle. Cosmic Hunger is a bite spell that can also target battles. Portent Tracker can tap to remove counters from battles, either yours or your opponent's. And War Historian is a 3-mana 3/3 with reach that gets indestructible if it attacks battles. With the deck that cares so much about battles, let's see some of the uncommon battles in the color pair, starting with Invasion of Zendikar, which is 4 mana to get 2 basic lands directly onto the battlefield untapped, and eventually turns into a 4/4 with Vigilance and Haste that can also tap for mana of any color. And in red we have Invasion of Mercadia, which is essentially Tormenting Voice on the front side, that eventually becomes a 3/3 that can turn cards in hand into tokens that get buffed and have haste. A couple of rares and mythics to look out for in this archetype include Deeproot Wayfinder, which is a cheap creature that rewards you for dealing combat damage to battles, and Doomscar Warrior, which has a ton of text and also rewards you for dealing damage to battles. Now, there are several rare and mythic rare battles in these colors as well, but in the interest of time, we'll just go ahead and skip those for today. Next up, we have Black-Green, which is the deck that cares the most about Incubate. Incubate is a relatively slow mechanic, so let's hope that this format gives us the time to hatch those Phyrexians as we look at our signpost uncommon for this deck, which is Elvish Vatkeeper, which is just a 3-mana 3/3 that incubates 2, but it also allows you to bypass the mana required to transform your tokens by paying 5 mana to double the number of counters on your Phyrexians on the other side. Our uncommon battle for this archetype is Invasion of Lorwyn, which is an expensive one at 6 mana but lets you destroy a creature equal to or less than the number of lands you control that eventually turns into a creature that has power and toughness equal to the number of lands you control. Let's start with some of the creatures that incubate in these colors, beginning with Completed Huntmaster, which allows you to incubate 3 at the cost of sacrificing creatures and artifacts. Ichor Drinker can incubate from your graveyard. Merciless Repurposing is a removal spell that also incubates 3. Converter Beast is a 4-mana 0/1 that incubates 5. And Blighted Burgeoning is a ramp spell that also incubates 2. Transforming your incubator tokens is usually payoff enough in a deck like this, but let's check out a couple more payoffs, including Gift of Completion, which lets you incubate 3 when it ETBs, and also lets you surveil when your transformed Phyrexian tokens die, and Tangled Skyline gains you 5 life, incubates 5, and gives all your Phyrexians reach. A couple of rares and mythics to look out for in this archetype include Bloated Processor, which incubates when it dies, a nice little bonus and 2-for-1, and Grafted Butcher, which gives all your Phyrexians menace until end of turn when it ETBs, pumps them an additional +1/+1, and can come back from your graveyard. Next up is green-white, which gets a theme that we've seen before, but not in a while, and that is +1/+1 counters. This archetype has the ability to be very explosive, so let's see if it can reach its full potential, beginning with Botanical Brawler, which can continually get more and more +1/+1 counters put onto it, as long as you're doing the whole +1/+1 counter thing. Our uncommon battle for this color pair is Invasion of Moag, which is a huge +1/+1 counter anthem for 4 mana on the front side, and eventually flips into a creature that keeps putting more counters on your permanents. Pretty right on the nose here. Let's start with the enablers for this deck, beginning with Bola Slinger as a stand-in for all backup creatures. Remember, backup distributes +1/+1 counters around, a thing this deck will love. Another stand-in is Infected Defector, which makes Incubate tokens, yet another use of +1/+1 counters. Angelic Intervention can protect your creatures and give them a counter. Storm the Seed Core can give 4 +1/+1 counters among creatures you control and give them Vigilance and Trample. And Placid Rottentail can give you counters from your graveyard. The only true payoff that I could find at common or uncommon besides our signposts was Kami of Whispered Hopes, which lets you assign an extra +1/+1 counter each time you get one, a pretty powerful effect. A couple of rares and mythics to look out for in this archetype include Archangel Elspeth, because, well, planeswalkers, and I mean it is nice that her -2 deals with +1/+1 counters as well. Ozolith the Shattered Spire has the same text that the Kami did in giving us extra counters, and can also give counters itself, and has cycling for some reason. And Dusk Legion Duelist would really love for you to give him some of those counters so he can do his job in drawing you extra cards. Next up is Blue-Green, which gets an entirely unique archetype, something I'm not sure we've ever seen before, and that is Transformation. This pair cares all about cards that transform and paying you off for when they do. So let's take a look at our signpost uncommon for this archetype, which is Mutagen Connoisseur, which is a flyer with Vigilance that also gets +1/+0 for each transform permanent you control. Our uncommon battle for this deck is Invasion of Pyrulia, which can let you get a land or a double-faced card off the top of your library with the front side, and then can eventually become a 4/4 with Trample and give your other transformed permanents Trample and Ward too. Now, we first have to have a high density of cards that transform, and we'll begin with Eyes of Gitaxias, which is a stand-in for all Incubate cards, as the Incubate tokens are tokens that do transform. Skyclave Aerialist is a 2-mana 2/1 flyer that can transform into a 2/4 that can either ramp you or draw you a card. Notvold Hermit is a 4-mana 4/4 that can eventually transform into a 5/5 that can make another creature a 5/5 whenever it attacks. And don't forget that battles are also transforming cards, so cards like Invasion of Zendikar that can eventually flip over to their backsides are all eminently playable in this archetype. A few payoffs at common and uncommon for this transformation build-around include Oculus Whelp, which is a flyer that can draw a card when it dies if you have a transformed permanent. Overgrown Pest can get you a land or a double-faced permanent from the top of your library when it ETBs, and Corruption of Tawashi lets you draw cards whenever you transform permanents. A couple of rares and mythics to look out for in this archetype include several of the rare and mythic rare battles, like Invasion of Ixalan, which can replace itself on ETB and eventually become a 4/3 that will have Indestructible most of the time, and Vorinclex, which is a transforming mythic rare bomb that I'm not sure how anyone will ever beat in Limited. Next up is Blue-Black, which gets the theme that Green-Black usually has, and that is the fact that the graveyard matters. We'll see if this change up in the usual color pairs can have any success, beginning with Halo Forager, which is a 3-mana 3/1 flyer that can cast instants and sorceries from any graveyard when it ETBs for just a little bit of extra mana. And our uncommon battle for this deck is Invasion of Amonkhet, which fills each player's graveyard on ETB and replaces itself, and can eventually become a copy of any creature in a graveyard that also happens to be a 4/4. Some of the cards that enable these graveyard shenanigans include Ichor Drinker, which can be exiled from your graveyard for an Incubate token. Moment of Truth replaces itself but can also put specific cards into your graveyard. And Ifara's Dispersal can surveil too, which gives you more ways to craft your graveyard. Included in the payoffs are several of the enablers, which is great to see for a synergistic deck like this, so we'll start with Disturbing Conversion, which mills each player for 2, and then can render an opponent's creature relatively useless. Flitting Gorilla mills each player for 2 when it dies, and can also return a key spell to the top of your library. Tenured Oilcaster becomes huge if you've milled your opponent enough, and can even help out in doing that when it attacks or blocks. And Unseal the Necropolis mills everyone for 3 and can get 2 creatures back from your own graveyard to your hand. A couple of rares and mythics to look out for in this archetype include Archpriest of Shadows, which can return creatures to the battlefield whenever you deal combat damage to a player or battle. Sea Double lets you choose both of its powerful modes if you've managed to mill your opponent for enough. And Breach the Multiverse mills everyone for 10, and then can get back what is effectively the 2 best creatures to the battlefield for the home team. Next up is Blue-Red, which also gets to play around with a mechanic that it usually doesn't get to, and that is Convoke. Usually we see this in creature-heavy archetypes like Green-White, so let's see how well Blue-Red can wear it, beginning with Joyful Storm Sculptor, which gives you 3 bodies to help convoke cards, and also pings your opponent every time you cast a spell with Convoke. Our uncommon battle for this deck is Invasion of Kaladesh, which creates a cheap flyer on ETB and eventually transforms into a flying vehicle that has power equal to the number of artifacts you control. We will first need a high density of Convoke cards, and we can start with Temporal Cleansing, which has Convoke and can tuck away a non-land permanent. Meeting of Minds has Convoke and draws 2 cards. Thunderhead Squadron is a big flyer with Convoke. Shatter the Source is a modal removal spell with Convoke. Stoke the Flames is an incredible burn spell with Convoke, and Shivan Branch Burner is a big, flying, hasty boy with Convoke. Some of the cards that best enable getting creatures onto the battlefield to convoke these powerful spells include Zarek's Strobe Knight, which can tap to create more creatures to help you convoke out more spells. Rowl's Reinforcements gives you 2 convoking bodies on just a single 2-drop, and Preening Champion also gives you 2 bodies with just 1 card. A couple of rares and mythics to look out for in this archetype include Shark Typhoon Jr. Chrome Host Seed Shark, which pays you off for casting non-creature spells by incubating each time. Zephyr Singer gives creatures flying counters if they help convoke it out. And Baral and Karizev create First Mate Ragavan and can help you cast more and more spells from your hand. Our last archetype is Black-White, which is the second of 2 tribal decks in the format, but this time it's the bad guys, the Phyrexians. Tribal is always interesting, and there are a ton of Phyrexians running around, so let's first take a look at Sculpted Perfection, which lets you incubate 2 on ETB and also is an anthem for all of your Phyrexians. Our uncommon battle for this archetype is Invasion of New Capenna, which lets you sack an artifact or creature to exile an artifact or creature that your opponent controls that can eventually become Holy Frazzle Cannon, my new catchphrase here on the channel. That is an equipment that can put a ton of counters on all of your Phyrexians. What good would a tribal deck be without creatures of that tribe? So let's take a look at just a few of the tons of Phyrexians in this set, beginning with Alabaster Host Sanctifier, which is a 2-mana 2/2 with lifelink. Infected Defector is a Phyrexian that dies into an Incubator token, and Etched Familiar is a Phyrexian that dies to drain your opponent for 2. A couple of payoffs for amassing all of these Phyrexians include Norn's Inquisitor, which incubates 2 when it ETBs and gives Phyrexians that transform an extra counter. Phyrexian Awakening incubates 4 and gives all your Phyrexians Vigilance. Phyrexian Censor makes sure each player can't cast more than 1 non-Phyrexian each turn and makes non-Phyrexians ETB tapped. And Gift of Completion incubates 3 and lets you surveil 1 when a Phyrexian you control dies. A couple of rares and mythics to look out for in this archetype include Bloated Processor, which is a Phyrexian itself that can sacrifice other Phyrexians to get counters and dies into another Phyrexian. And Grafted Butcher, which gives all your Phyrexians menace until end of turn, buffs them all with +1/+1, and can keep coming back from your graveyard. Thanks so much for sticking around to the end of this video if you are still here. I'm always excited for the release of this video because I know it will be very beneficial to have all of this information in one place so that you have an easy way to find what you need if you wish to revisit the video throughout the week. If you enjoyed this content, feel free to share it with a friend or two, as there's a decent chance they might like it as well. If you're already subscribed to the channel, thanks for being here today, and if you're not, go ahead and click that subscribe button to stay on top of set review season and have access to consistent high-quality drafts here on the channel as soon as the set launches on Arena. Looks like that'll do it for this video, and I'll see you next time here at Daily Draft.